Well, that was absolutely superb, so give a big hand to Discernible who made that. Very scary and very amusing, but they left out one little comment that Gladys Berejiklian made, which was, she said at one point, "I would not be in the same room as someone who is unvaccinated." The Premier of this state, in this Parliament, said to the citizens of New South Wales, "I will not let you in this room if you are unvaccinated." So that's how bad it got. But that video is really important because there's a tendency to forget what actually happened during COVID. I have a similar video. Oh, by the way, my name is Rowan Dean and I'm the editor of The Spectator Australia, and I have of TV shows on Sky as well, which where we frequently play a similar clip to that, not as good as that one, but a similar clip where we show Jay all the worst things that happened, the police assaults, particularly in Victoria, but it was not just Victoria, it was New South Wales, Queensland as well, where the abuse of individual freedom was just shocking and terrifying, and rightly was condemned around the world. Thank you for coming this evening, and thank you for John Smith to putting in all the effort to get Jay Bhattacharya out here. I'll tell you in a second how I come to know Jay, but first of all, we've got three really important speakers here tonight. Jay from his medical background, Gigi, who we've also had on Outsiders and other Sky shows as well, from the University of Sydney, who was so brave during COVID and spoke up. The only academic, I think, in Australia who actually dared to apply some academic kind of knowledge to what was actually happening in front of us. The rest, of course, all ran for cover because they are cowards. And Iain, who's here as well to speak about the kind of legal side. So we've got medical, economic and legal, and that's a great way to look at what happened during COVID. So I'll just quickly say that it is so important not to forget, and that's why footage like that is going to become more and more important, because everybody who abused their positions of authority is desperately praying that we do all forget, that it's kind of overlooked, that there's a reason, there's an excuse. You even now, just 18 months from some of the worst of those atrocities, it's almost impossible to believe that it happened. It's almost like, no, it must be a nightmare, I must have dreamt that. It didn't really happen, but it did. And as we'll talk about in a second, but I believe we need a Royal Commission into the abuse of power. And for me, it's the abuse of power by the politicians who we trust, or used to trust, and we saw just some of the worst, but they were by no means alone. And the abuse of power by the health authorities, and that's was just in my mind, it's criminal what went on. We even had one of the guys, again, this is talking about the vaccine mandates thing, but one of the guys saying, one of the health officers saying, "We're going to make life very uncomfortable for you in Australia if you're not vaccinated." Sorry, who are you? You're a bureaucrat. You're going to make life uncomfortable for your fellow Australians who pay your salary? Forget it. Anyway, so there's a lot to talk about. I'm just pleased to say that right at the beginning of COVID, so in March of 2020, so there's been all the horror, all the scare, everyone, shut the borders, that was great, terrific, Ruby Princess, all that stuff was going on. Because I have a Sunday morning television show, and part of the role of journalists is to kind of find out what's going on and maybe get some independent opinions about what is going on in the world. Not having the full resources of governments or even large media organisations behind me, like the ABC, for example, would have, I had to rely on my most trusted source to find some information, my phone. So I did what apparently no other journalist in Australia no politician and no health authority could actually do. I used my phone to find out about epidemiology, went on a couple of social media sites one evening, and within about an hour and a half, I'd spotted a couple of things of this man here, Gigi Bhattacharya. This looks interesting. Bloke at Stanford University, epidemiologist. He was out there, he made a couple of comments on a couple of US shows saying, well, maybe it's not quite as bad as we need to worry about, but great, let's get his opinion. So I, again, using my phone, they're not that difficult. I went, Gigi Bhattacharya, Stanford University, here is the bloke, yep, highly qualified, and I should tell you, he's so qualified, I'm going to let him tell you how qualified he is in a second. But believe you me, this man is extremely qualified. So I thought, okay, look up his CV on, fantastic, because as journalists, we like to have authoritative sources we go to, epidemiologist, expert on what's going on. We spoke on the phone. I said, can you get on the TV show? Yeah, that'd be great. He came on via Zoom or Skype. It was all, pretty basic stuff. March 2020. Dr. Gigi Bhattacharya told Australia on Sky News Sunday morning, we don't need to panic. It's very, very, I won't paraphrase him, but basically he was saying you don't need to lock down. The virus, you need to protect the elderly, you need to make sure, use basic measures like, so I remember Jay saying, just do a bit of social distancing, just common sense stuff, someone's sneezing all over you, maybe take a step back. No masks are a waste of time, don't worry about that. And he was quite specific that until the vaccine came along, pretty much there was just common sense. If you could shut your borders, if you were lucky enough to be an island, like Australia, shut your borders, great, that'll keep it out, but basically get on with life, etc., etc. That message was out there and available to any single Australian bureaucrat, politician, anybody. Yet within 12 months, myself and my co-host Rita Panahi and our great friend Alan Jones had been hauled up in front of the Australian Senate. They demanded that we appear, we refused to explain ourselves as to why we were spreading misinformation via Sky News. And one of the names the Australian Senate cited, I'm pretty certain there were a few of them, as people we had gone to as spreading part of this misinformation was the gentleman who set up the Great Barrington Declaration, Gigi Bhattacharya. So the Australian Senate tried to shut down my show, which they've repeatedly tried to do and failed thus far. Tried to shut down Rita and Alan from speaking, purely because we wanted to know the truth about what was happening with COVID. That was it. They failed, but this is why we need to hear from Jay, we need to hear from Gigi, and we need to hear from Iain the truth about what was happening during COVID and how the authorities misused their power, in my opinion. That's it from me. Dr. Gigi Bhattacharya, you've come on our show several times. You've always been the voice of common sense. Welcome to Sydney.
Thank you. So I'm gonna tell you, you didn't have to go through what you went through the last 2 years, 2.5 years. You did not. It did not have to happen. So I guess I should tell a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of medicine at Stanford. I've been a professor since about 2001. I've been at Stanford for 36 years. I'm 54 years old, you can subtract. I've been a professor for a long time. I have a PhD in economics and an MD. I've been writing about infectious disease epidemiology for a long time. When COVID hit in January 2020 is when I first started to think about it in earnest. It was very clear to me that like other respiratory viral pandemics, we didn't really know the death rate. The early estimates were 3-4% death rate. That was a lot. It was based on estimates of people coming to the hospital, coming to the attention of medical professionals. Of the people that came to the hospital, 3% died. But this is a highly infectious respiratory viral pandemic. That meant there had to have been many other people that got infected that we just didn't know about. That's what happened in 2009 during the swine flu pandemic. The early estimates were 3-4% mortality rate, but then there were a whole series of studies that were done checking for antibodies in the population. This is in 2009. It turned out in swine flu that the death rate was actually, get ready for this, 0.01%. 99.99% survival. That was my first thought when I heard about this pandemic. I thought, well, what if this is not as deadly as people say it is, because we just don't know who's had it. So I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in early March or mid-March 2020. First op-ed I'd ever written in my life. I spent my entire life writing articles in journals, in peer-reviewed journals. If you guys go read them, you'll maybe the second or third person to ever read any of them. It'll make me very happy, you know. But I've never written an op-ed. I've never been on TV. I just was an academic. I wrote this piece in the Wall Street Journal saying we need to have an antibody study to see how widespread the disease already is in March of 2020. I knew immediately that something was very wrong, because I started getting hate mail. I started getting death threats. I had colleagues of mine disown me on Facebook, defriend me on Facebook. I said, wait, what is going on? I'm just making a hypothesis. Maybe I'm wrong. And so I ran 2 studies in the early days of the pandemic to measure the antibody, how many people in California had antibodies to COVID that indicated that they'd had infections. Okay, you are pretty both overwhelmed and underwhelmed at the same time. It turned out about 3% of the population of Santa Clara County, where I lived, and 4% of LA County had antibodies. Doesn't sound like a lot, right? Doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually was a lot. This was in early April 2020. This is unlike, by the way, Australia. I'll talk about Australia in just a second. But in early April 2020, 3% meant for every person that had been identified with COVID, there were 50 people walking around California that had antibodies that nobody knew had COVID. 50 people. The death rate wasn't 3%, 4%. Actually, the death rate was 0.2% in the community. 0.2%. 99.8% survival. And there was also this very steep age gradient. Older people had a much higher death rate. Younger people had a much lower death. In fact, for children, the survival rate is something on the order of 99.9999. I'm going to run out of nines. I did some water nines. It's very, very high. COVID is very far from the worst threat that children face. More children have died, I think, of drowning in the United States than of COVID through the pandemic. So, I put the study out, then immediately, again, I got a whole range of attacks on me. From my colleagues, I got hit pieces written by BuzzFeed authors accusing me of taking money for the study. Well, actually, I took $0 for the study. I've taken $0 for all of my COVID work because I just don't feel right to profit from this illness. These BuzzFeed authors started attacking me and my family. And by the way, you know how to lose weight in a pandemic? What you do is you get the newspapers to write horrible attack pieces on you. You get your friends to disown you. You get deep anxiety, 30 pounds of weight loss. It's beautiful. I'm thinking about the diet book. Actually, I don't really recommend that. Just I don't do that again. But so I did this study, and I thought, okay, this study should end the pandemic. 99.8% survival. There's a group of people that really are harmed by the virus, older people. Let's work to protect them. For the rest of society, let's not lock down. Locking down before the pandemic, in 2019, the pandemic plans never envisioned locking down whole societies for extended periods of time where healthy people were quarantined. Maybe quarantines of people who are sick. Maybe. Even that is an extreme measure. But quarantining of whole populations, healthy people, that's crazy. That's a truly fringe idea. Let's jump forward. Let's jump to Australia. Actually, you know what? You know the reason why you all are extremely clever people, and I mean this sincerely. But the thing that happened to you that was the most clever thing you did that got rid of COVID from your shores in early in the pandemic is that you're located in the southern hemisphere. If I wish that we had also been located in the southern hemisphere. Actually, because what happened is COVID had seeded throughout the world, but because it spreads more easily during the winter in the northern hemisphere. March is winter. It spread all through the northern hemisphere very rapidly. 3-4%. It's a very high rate. What that means, by the way, 3-4% means you can't get to zero. You're never going to get to zero. It's too far gone. This disease is spread in cats, dogs, apparently bats get it, I've been told. 80% of white-tailed deer have had COVID in 2021 in the United States. I heard that a dolphin can get COVID. Anyway, so there's, mammals can get COVID, right? So in Australia, because you're located in the southern hemisphere, when it arrived in your summer, it didn't spread all that widely. You closed your borders, probably that's the most effective thing you did, and COVID went away. You didn't really need to lock down. It was going to probably go away mostly by itself, because it wasn't really spreading in the summer all that effectively. But the border closure, what it did is it sealed you off from the rest of the world. And here's the really pernicious thing it did. It created this lockdown triumphalism. So whenever I would appear in public, people would throw at me, well, Australia did it. They locked down, they conquered COVID. Your beautiful country is the center of the pro-lockdown argument. I'm going to tell you why I think it was a dismal failure in just a second, but I have to say that that early success with getting rid of COVID led you to essentially a trap that essentially imprisoned you for 2 years. It became a point of pride among politicians, a point of let's all work together to keep COVID out. 100 days of lockdown, 200 days of lockdown, doesn't matter. The only important thing in life is getting rid of COVID. And when I would look at Australian polls, I would be absolutely shocked that so much of Australia actually supported this policy. When I saw the human rights abuses that you all saw. But it was a big contrast. You have Australia that had successfully dealt with COVID, and you have the rest of the world that had utterly failed. The consequences of that policy, I think, you have to tell it, you have to talk about it, you have to think about it, because the consequence of that policy was not actually health; it was deep unhealth, lack of health. For children, you lock down hundreds of days of missed school. Well, what does that accomplish? But actually, there's a literature on this from before the pandemic. And the literature says that even short periods of missed school have long-term consequences on the life of our children. The short periods of missed school means that our children will lead poorer lives, and as a consequence of leading poorer lives, they will lead less healthy, shorter lives. One estimate in the United States from the spring lockdown alone of 2020, the estimate was that in the United States, we robbed our children of 5.5 million life years. Just from the spring lockdown. What about mental health consequences? There was an estimate in July of 2020 in the United States that from the U.S. CDC that estimated that 1 in 4 young adults had seriously considered suicide in June of 2020. From basically 2 months of lockdown. 1 in 4 young adults seriously considered suicide. I thought that would end the pandemic, end the lockdowns. And you all suffered through more than 2 months, more than 3 months, more than 4. What I learned is that Melbourne suffered through 270 days of lockdown. I can only begin to imagine the psychological toll it took on people. I gave a talk in Melbourne yesterday to an audience of 500 people, and I could sense the trauma of those lockdowns. You could feel the trauma of the lockdowns I mean, just looking at these images that we just saw, I'm traumatized just thinking about it. Because you were forced to, delayed health care, absolutely necessary preventive health care for years. Men and women will die of colon cancer, late stage colon cancer that should have been picked up earlier. Women will come in Australia, be diagnosed with late stage breast cancer that should have been picked up last year, that could have been treated effectively and would survive instead. The health harms from lockdown are not things that just immediately disappear. These are things that take a long time to play itself out. In 2021, when there was no COVID in Australia, the excess death rate, that's the death rate from all causes above what you would have expected from 2015 to 2019, was 3% higher. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that means thousands of people died essentially from the lockdown in 2021. And this year, the excess death rate is something on the order of 15, 16. Still, the year's not done. It'll end up being like 16. Might even be near 20%, one higher than the norm. That is. Now, I don't know for certain exactly what all of that is, but a lot of it is the lockdowns. The suicidality is just actual suicide. Alcoholism leads to death. Drug overdoses. Even in young people, you're seeing this high excess death rate, in part because of the extended effects of lockdown. Lockdowns were not good for your health. In fact, lockdowns, I have trouble thinking of things that are much more bad for people's health at a population scale than lockdown. It is the single worst public health peacetime disaster in history.
Now, I'll just remind you, you're hearing this now. Jay Bhattacharya appeared about 4 or 5 times on Sky News, most of them on Outsiders, from March 2020, before he'd even done his first study. He then reappeared to give us the results of that study. He then reappeared saying, when lockdowns were launched, saying this is a mistake. He then reappeared when he launched the Great Barrington Declaration. I'll get Jay to talk about that in a minute. And he repeatedly stated what you just heard based on data, his experience, his evidence. There is no excuse. And yet the politicians and the bureaucrats will say, oh, no, we didn't know that. It's all hindsight. You're talking with hindsight. No, the facts were out there all along. Jay, give a big hand to Jay. Gigi Foster was also, our local hero. When I heard she was at Sydney Uni, I was going, cognitive dissonance. So we have to make common sense at Sydney Uni.
Gigi's my hero too.
So Gigi was speaking out from the point of view of economics all the way through on the ABC. She was on When They Let Her on Sky. Gigi, tell us now, you've been totally vindicated. What's it feel like?
What does it feel like? I feel cathartic more than anything, and I just feel I found a new tribe. By the way, I work at University of New South Wales.
Sorry, I get them confused.
I know you do. That's understandable. Look, all of the university sector.
You do transgender studies there as well, don't you? With the side course in climate radiology.
Unfortunately, the university sector is, as I say, they have a lot to answer for. But I've been listening here to Jay and thinking, what a wonderful review of the ridiculousness of this period, and what can I add? One of the things that I really was struck by in your comments is the number of times that you said, okay, well, I did that, and then I thought that would end the pandemic, or this happened, and then I thought that would end the pandemic, right? that was exactly my feeling for at least 2 or 3 months in the middle of 2020. So the first time that I publicly called out the lockdowns was about 2 weeks after you wrote that Wall Street Journal article, and I was on ABC Radio National, where I used to have a podcast and talk radio program with Peter Martin, AM. That was my co-host, and I had not told Peter, nor had I told my producer beforehand, that I was planning to simply say what I thought was patently clear from the data, that locking down the whole population was wrong, and we should focus our attention on the elderly and the people who would actually get sick from this virus. And I said this, and there was kind of a pallor that came over the studio. Now it is a pre-record, right? But pre-record in my book does not mean you take back what you meant. Right? It just means you take back your swear words, right? So, I said this is what I think, and we're gonna run, and so the producer, to her credit, let it go. But then the ABC received an awful lot of editorial complaints, right? People writing from all over Australia saying that woman is a danger to public health. You've got to get her off the air. Right? And then the same thing as you, right? Death threats, the hate mail. I mean, although I will say most of the mail, and I think this is probably true for you too, Jay, I would say 80%, if not 90% now, higher than 90 now, of the mail that I received during this whole period from people, who hear you or read you or whatever, is loving, positive, supportive emails and messages of support and phone and everything, right? It's been wonderful. And typically the ones who are not supportive will have 1 or 2 liners. Go back to your Yankee doodle home, you granny killing Trumpkinot neoliberal. So they're reasonably easy to handle. And of course I always respond to such people. And thank you for your email. It seems I haven't reached you. Let me try again, right? And then set out the argument, right? And I suppose it is a little bit autistic to keep doing that over and over, but I think you need a little bit of a kind of blindness to the social realities that are happening in order to keep just saying what you see in data, right? So the autism I'm not autistic, but I have a lot of people in the resistance, I have noticed, have a bit of an ability to resist the wave of social pressure somehow, whether they're autistic, whether they think of themselves as somewhat apart, elite. I was a very lonely child, was never part of the in crowd, and so I learned very early on to think of my fellow man as sort of in a petri dish over there, and I could look through the looking glass, right? That's why I'm a social scientist, and that really suits me. It suits me quite well, and it is a little bit lonely, I guess. I'm not lonely now, but I was lonely as a kid, and that quality, oh my goodness, has that paid dividends during this period, and my interest in things beyond just the traditional economic, but in power and love and sort of networks of people, and how those factors in our lives drive resource allocation decisions. And I'm an economist, so that means I'm interested in resource allocation decisions. So if I don't understand power and loyalty and attachment to things that are intangible, and ideology, right, and the ability of a person to be controlled by their fear, then I'm not understanding resource allocation decisions. This is my argument to my fellow economists, who basically say, well, yeah, you can tell yourself that, but really we have these models which are the queen of the social sciences, the best predictive models of human behavior, full stop, and we're going to sit on our laurels and make lots of money, basically telling the world that this is how people behave. So this has basically been my life's work for 15 years anyway, trying to open and broaden that discussion amongst economics faculty all over the place, not just in Australia, but any place, about how really people actually work, what is actually driving our decisions. And not just because I care about religiosity or particular types of how power affects us or whatever. I mean, those are interesting, but I'm interested in the social effects, the resource allocation decision effects. And of course, locking a whole society down is a big resource allocation decision, right? Hello, we're going to press pause on your economy, and somehow, as if that's even possible, right? And with a complete ignorance of all of these effects that Jay so eloquently described. By the way, which are described in my latest book. I am not beyond making money off this period. No, I wouldn't say that. I make very small amounts of money off my books. It's really, I write them so that people can read them. If you want to buy The Great COVID Panic, which was my book from last year with Paul Frieders and Michael Baker, that is out there and I can sell them after this. But we also have oh, thank you very much. Yeah, this is the one. And then we also have a new book with Sanjeev Sablock, whom some of you may remember was a Victorian Treasury economist until mid-2020, when he left the Treasury because he was no longer able to speak his mind about how what was happening at government was wrong. And so we have a new book called Do Lockdowns and Border Closures Serve the Greater Good? Because, of course, the greater good, quote unquote, is the thing, that economists are supposed to be maximizing when we give policy advice. And it was certainly the flag in which the lockdowns were wrapped. Yeah? So we have this, and we document the costs of these various policies in Australia in terms of these different categories, like the crowded out healthcare, the effects on the children. We also estimate, and I think it's actually an underestimate, I think a lot of our estimates in there are underestimates of costs, but we estimate that there will be, on average, about a week's less lifespan of every Australian who went through the COVID period. And, obviously also the debt, which you didn't mention, Jay, but it is obviously one of the huge tragedies of this period that we have thieved from future generations. And not just that, but I mean, if you think about the opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost is the value of the things that you could have had.
So Gigi, right? If you're talking about economics.
I am talking about economics.
Does that make you a Grammy killer?
Yeah, apparently, yeah. Granny killer and many other things too. Yeah, no, just a piece of human excrement. That was one of my favorites as well. I just keep a jar, and just put them in. It's really good. I can show my grandkids one day. But that kind of thinking, which is the economics thinking, there is scarcity. You only have so many dollars. Where are you going to put these dollars? And if you put them into something which just basically is a salve to a wound you inflicted. And this is what happened. I remember early on in March and April, I was thinking, what we've done here, we're walking along, and we stub our toe, which is COVID. And then we decide, in order to fix that, well, we better stab ourselves in the stomach. Okay, right? And then we got to wrap it up. Okay, well, let's wrap up the wound, right? And we could have just hobbled to the hospital down the road, but instead we have to, drag ourselves with this, incredibly expensive dressing, and it's much more of a big deal than it has to be because we inflicted a stab wound on ourselves, And so that was going through my head. I think I dreamt it. You dream these weird metaphorical things, and that's what it meant, right? I mean, I'm not Jung, but it does sometimes inform. What is the unconscious trying to tell you? How are you processing this information? And so that debt could have been accumulated for expenditures that would have helped Australia. To advance our productivity, to advance our education, to invest in the social and economic stocks of this country so that we'd be that much further ahead than we were. And I mean, I don't have a problem with debt per se. It's debt in service to nothing, in service to having tread water for 2.5 years and now having to pay back from future expenditures on things that actually matter to health and human well-being. So for me, that was another tragedy, and that's a huge part of the cost. And of course, the mental health damage, as you say, which happened at the time and was basically completely ignored by these bureaucrats making the decisions. So it was really just a little nod, oh yeah, we'll give some money to Lifeline, and then everything will be, that'll be ticking the box of caring about mental health, which I just find completely offensive and disrespectful towards particularly the young people who were hurt so badly by this period, and also the people who were already worse off, who didn't have the luxury of sitting in their living rooms on their Zoom laptops and still working and being able to have their groceries and all their other things delivered to them by the plebs. So the elitism of the whole thing is just it stinks. So all of that is just to say that I agree with everything that Jay said pretty much, although I'm a little questioning on whether we ever could have really gotten a value on net of closing our borders, right? I mean, I think you're right that closing the international borders did keep COVID out, and we had fewer COVID cases as a result, but that then just delayed the development of our herd immunity, and it delayed our understanding that we could live with this virus, and as you say, it caught the politicians in the web of we have to continue to be seen and to portray ourselves as the saviors of COVID. So there are many dimensions of this problem and reasons why it happened that we discuss in the Great COVID Panic, which are really broad social scientific issues. So things like fear and the effect that fear has on a person and then on his society, how that fear can lead into the development of a crowd, of a herd, right, and a herd thinking kind of mentality, which we saw in witch hunts, we saw in prohibition times, we've seen in 1930s Germany. I mean, we've seen examples of this, and the fact that people like Jay would be called out as granny killers or defriended on Facebook for having simply just stated facts and said, oh, I have an opinion about this. That is a signal, right? And I remember as well thinking in April, surely this will pass. Surely people will get over the fear, right? And we'll go back to regular policies. But no. And even in August, when I addressed the Victorian Parliament, and gave them a proof of concept lockdown CBA, cost benefit analysis, that said, here you go, this is what you should be doing, this is how you justify policies in this country, particularly when they have such massive economic effects. Even then, I was sort of hoping that somehow naively that would wake people up. But by that point, we had already had the formation of the COVID crowd, right, from which people drew security, right? Being a member of that crowd was comforting. It gave you something to stand for. It gave you friends. It gave you a mission. It gave you a purpose, a meaning. Right? And that was also scary for me because I thought, was your life so meaningless before?
The answer being yes, probably.
Probably, people didn't like it. So anyway, all of that is to say, I agree with Jay, and I'm happy to take more questions. I think we should probably not speak too long because we want to allow a lot of interaction later.
Gigi, we'll get back to that question you posed there because it's a really good one about the international borders. But first of all, let me just say, please buy every copy of Gigi's 2 books there, because there is more common sense in both those books than in this entire building over the last 4 years. You might sound Gigi is a great bloke and a very brave individual as well. Now you'll have noticed TV dude, no papers, well, one bit. Medical guy, no papers, no. Economist, no papers, no. The last guy on the table, gotta be law. Ian Berenson, Professor Ian Berenson.
Well, I'm sorry to announce that Ian Berenson couldn't be here this evening. I'm actually Ian Benson.
Sorry. So far I've got 2 out of 3
University of
wrong,
Sydney,
so
was
that's
it?
pretty good.
Anything else you want to hear, Rowan?
I don't deal in facts, I'm a TV person.
Well, I'm that great oxymoron, a humble lawyer and a law professor, and I teach legal philosophy, legal history, law and religion, and all sorts of things that surprisingly gave me some insights, I guess, into what just happened for the last 2.5 years. Because the origins of what we've been through go way back. This is not a recent thing. What we are in fact experiencing is a separation of 2 important concepts that the Greeks understood and the classical education understood, and contemporary schooling, which is not education, can't fathom. The first is the separation of techne from telos. Techne is skills or art. It's how you do something. Telos is the end or purpose. It's why you do something. And education for the last couple of centuries has become increasingly technical at the expense of its purpose. So this is why politicians don't understand how to do politics. Medics don't understand how to do medicine, with the great exception of my friend to the left here. Economists don't understand what the role of the economy is. And lawyers, God help us, don't understand what justice is. So this is a catastrophic situation we're in culturally. And COVID has simply brought to the surface the problem in all these disciplines and between them. Because in order to have a functioning university, you need to take the variety and bring it towards one conception of culture. The disciplines have to interrelate. Well, our separation of techne from telos isn't just in each discipline, it's between the disciplines. So when Aristotle says in the Politics and in the Nicomachean Ethics, the student of politics must first understand the soul and virtues above all things, you can see that contemporary politicians, if asked to articulate what the virtues are, would be as silent as a room of contemporary barristers and judges in this state, certainly, asked to give a grounding for justice in terms of the human person and community. So we're in trouble. And COVID has simply brought to the surface the nature and depth of our problem. Now, what do? Well, we've got lots of legal tools. The problem is law and culture are in an interesting relationship. Law influences culture and culture influences law. So if the breakdown is of the sort I've described in my opening comments, then you have a real task ahead of you in order to figure out how to reconnect these disparate dimensions of culture which have become fragmented, disintegrated, and deracinated. We've lost our roots, we've lost our integrity, we've lost our frame. And this is the woeful state of contemporary cultures, not just here in Australia, I'm afraid, but everywhere. This problem didn't start recently. It started a long time ago. It's been written about clearly in educational books as early as John Henry Newman's idea of a university in the mid-19th century. But the problem goes back to the Enlightenment. And I could bore you all night with discussing philosophers and how they pointed out this was going to happen. They wrote books with titles like Education at the Crossroads, The Crisis of Western Education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we stopped speaking the language of virtues. We replaced it with Nietzsche's language of values. And everybody thinks values, which comes from the marketplace, is an adequate replacement for virtues. It isn't. You have your values, I have mine, don't push yours on me, is no adequate account of what it is to be virtuous, in which we share the virtues, but have to adjust in terms of our first nature through habit till they become second nature to us. All of this is lost. I teach in a Catholic university. Almost none of my students know anything about virtue, yet virtue is supposed to be the basis of that moral development within the self, within the Catholic tradition. So all the traditions have this deracination. So, again, what do? Well, we talk about it, and I'm just delighted to be part of this, and particularly here in this place, a parliament, where we are starting to make respectful a dissenting voice in relation to this COVID ridiculousness that we've all lived through. Keep your distance, wear masks, be afraid, be very afraid. This is insanity. And the virus was never really that deadly for most people. This man, too, to my left, Dr. Bhattacharya's evidence in the leading cases in this state was simply ignored. He says, and I've got all the cases here, that's what these papers are about. They're just intended to impress you, actually. You'll notice I'm not reading any of them, having laid them out so carefully. By the way, 10 minutes is what I used to get as counsel for an intervener when I was a barrister in Canada at the Supreme Court of Canada. So I'm used to sort of 10 minutes trying to get in a lot of stuff. And as I said to my friend this morning, if it isn't in your head when you stand up, don't stand up. So this was actually all read and ingested, and what I'm trying now to do is to projectile vomit it to you in the form of digestible pieces of information. So, where are we? Well, C.S. Lewis once said in an essay far too little read, called Willing Slaves of the Welfare State, that I would not like to live in a society in which public policy is determined by doctors. Now, why did he... Now, as the son, brother, grandson, father of doctors, I have to tell you that I have nothing against doctors, but medicine is one aspect of a cultural understanding. So here's my recommendations for what we need in law sooner rather than later, based on the legal decisions. J. Bhattacharya's evidence that this virus was not deadly to almost everybody was ignored entirely by the judges in New South Wales, using a series of legal techniques. The first was cabinet privilege, and the second was on whom was the onus. The onus was placed on the applicants who were subject to mandatory vaccine orders to prove something they had no possibility of getting the evidence of, because everything was hidden behind cabinet privilege. Tony's sitting in the front row here. He ran some of these cases. Cabinet privilege was used to screen the minister's evidentiary basis. Similarly, the onus was in the wrong place. The onus should be on the government to prove what it's claiming, particularly when the result is massive interference with civil liberties. The other problem you have in Australia is you have legal positivism as absolutely dominant. Now, what is legal positivism? It's a theory of law that arose largely in the 20th century, but with earlier antecedents, which effectively says that law and morals are separated. Now, what this means is that law becomes increasingly simply the subject matter of power delegation. It's either from the parliament or it's from judicial decisions. The problem with the tradition of the West in terms of the dignity of the person and the basis of rights is that they were understood to be prior to law, not the result of law. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 is just that, a declaration, in which every single statement in that preamble says, whereas, recognizing, etc., These principles existed before the law, before the Declaration. They don't come from it. You understand that? So what's happened here is, with positivism dominating the law in this state particularly, but in Australia generally, if it's not in a law, the judges don't think it exists. So what they actually, you have no Human Rights Act in New South Wales. This from a Canadian perspective, which is where my accent comes from, about. So for Canadians who have human rights acts everywhere, in fact, almost too much human rights recognition in a way, because it's now stretching to absurd lengths there. I won't go into details, but I could keep you in stitches with laughter describing some of the human rights cases we've had in Canada. But here, you don't have enough human rights protection. But you need more than the framework of law. The Soviet Union famously had an excellent constitution. The problem was between the constitution and the reality of its political order. Here, you don't just need a Human Rights Act. You need judges and barristers and a culture of law that can understand them and can put them into place. So liberty, conscience, mobility, assembly, freedom of speech and expression, all of these are fundamental rights that you lost the story of here in New South Wales.
Big hand for him.